The cell was never truly dark. Even when the lights went out, the faint glow of the hallway seeped through the cracks of the iron door, casting thin, trembling lines across the concrete floor. Inside, Raymond Holt lay awake, counting the seconds as they dragged past. 30 years. 30 years of watching the same shadows crawl across the same walls. 30 years of reliving a crime he didn't commit. He had been 27 when they locked him away, a mechanic from a small town, quiet, hardworking, known more for his patience than his temper. That patience was tested on a cold October night when the police found his boss, David Kane, dead in the workshop. A bullet to the head. Raymond was the last one seen with him. The gun had his fingerprints. The motive, money and a supposed affair, was conveniently painted for the jury. Within months, he was convicted of first-degree murder. The years that followed broke something inside him, slowly and methodically, like a bone bent until it snapped. He wrote letters no one answered, filed appeals that went nowhere, and prayed to a God who never replied. In the first few years, he believed someone would come forward, someone would confess, or the truth would surface. But the world moved on without him. His mother died, his wife remarried, and his name was whispered only in pity. It wasn't until his 17th year inside that a new inmate arrived, a man named Curtis, quiet but observant, with a habit of studying faces like they were maps. Curtis had connections on the outside, people who knew people. Over time, he became Raymond's only friend, someone who listened without judgment. And one night, during a storm that rattled the bars and shook the walls, Curtis whispered something that changed everything. "I heard about your case," he said. "David Kane wasn't just your boss. He was laundering money for a guy named Eli Mercer. Kane was about to talk to the feds. Mercer had him silenced. You were the easy scapegoat." Raymond didn't speak. He just stared at the floor, the rain leaking through the ceiling in steady, rhythmic drops. "Mercer's still out there," Curtis continued. "Big business now. Real estate, construction, he's got a family, kids, the whole picture. You rotted in here so he could sleep in silk sheets." That night, Raymond stopped praying for freedom. He started planning it. Over the next 13 years, he listened more than he spoke. He learned the language of criminals, their habits, their mistakes, the way they hid money, moved weapons, built fake lives. Curtis introduced him to people who could help once he was out. And in that time, Raymond built something Mercer never expected, patience sharpened into a weapon. When his release finally came, thanks to a DNA appeal filed by a nonprofit group that specialized in wrongful convictions, Raymond walked out of prison an old man. His hair was white, his hands trembled slightly, but his eyes burned with a calm fury. The world had changed, but revenge was timeless. He didn't go home. There was no home left. He rented a small room in an aging motel off the highway and began to dig. Mercer was easy to find. He had built an empire on deception, just as Curtis said. He owned multiple companies, charities, and a mansion that looked like something out of a glossy magazine. He smiled in photographs, shook hands with politicians, and gave motivational speeches about redemption. Raymond watched from a distance. He studied Mercer's routine, his family, his security, his habits. Every morning, Mercer jogged the same route through his gated community. Every Thursday, he had dinner with his wife at the same restaurant. Every Friday night, he met someone in a dimly lit parking garage, a meeting that didn't appear on any public calendar. That meeting was the crack in the armor. For months, Raymond followed the pattern, learning the rhythm of Mercer's secret life. Eventually, he saw the truth. The man Mercer met wasn't a friend. It was his enforcer, a remnant of his criminal past. They still moved money, still kept secrets buried deep under corporate paperwork. Raymond recorded everything. Every conversation. Every exchange. Every face. Then one night he made his move. He intercepted the enforcer first, a man named Riley, outside the bar where Mercer held his private meetings. A struggle, quick and silent, ended with Riley in the trunk of an old car, duct-taped and terrified. Raymond didn't want to kill him. Not yet. He wanted information. And after an hour in an abandoned warehouse, Riley gave him everything: names, accounts, proof linking Mercer to the murder that destroyed Raymond's life. It wasn't rage that guided Raymond anymore. It was precision. He released Riley, left him tied up outside a police station, and mailed the evidence to every news outlet in the city. But before he exposed Mercer publicly, he wanted one thing. One conversation. Mercer came home late that night, parking his luxury car in the driveway of his mansion, unaware of the old man waiting in the shadows. Raymond stepped forward, calm, the rain falling in a familiar rhythm. Mercer froze when he saw him. For a moment, he didn't recognize the face. Then realization set in, and the color drained from his skin. "You," he whispered. 30 years, Raymond said softly. 30 years for a crime you committed. Mercer stammered, backing away, words tumbling out, excuses, bargains, denials. But Raymond didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply raised a small revolver, the same model used in the murder all those years ago. "I'm not here for justice," he said. "Justice died a long time ago." The sound that followed was muted by the storm, a single crack swallowed by thunder. By morning, Mercer was found slumped against his marble driveway, a single bullet wound to the chest. In his pocket was a flash drive containing every piece of evidence of his crimes. The news called it a shocking act of vigilante justice. The police never found the shooter. Weeks later, in a small diner miles away, a quiet man in a worn jacket paid his bill and walked out before dawn. No one knew his name. No one noticed the faint scar on his wrist, or the way his eyes lingered on the sunrise as if he hadn't seen one in years. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But for the first time in 3 decades, he felt something close to peace. And as the morning light washed over him, Raymond Holt disappeared into the crowd, a man finally free, not because the world forgave him, but because he'd written his own ending. The road stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the misty countryside. Raymond drove without a destination, just the soft hum of the engine and the faint hiss of rain against the windshield. He hadn't planned what came next. After 30 years in a cage, he'd learned to live moment by moment. But freedom, he realized, could be just as suffocating as prison when you had nowhere to go. He stopped at a small roadside diner near the edge of town, one of those places that smelled of burnt coffee and old grease. The waitress, kind eyes, tired smile, asked if he was passing through. He nodded, lied that he was visiting family. She didn't press. People rarely did anymore. He ate in silence, watching the world move around him, wondering how it had all gone on without him. But inside, a storm still churned. The act of revenge, though swift and decisive, hadn't given him the satisfaction he expected. There was no cinematic closure, no triumphant release. Just silence. The truth was, Mercer's death had been inevitable, but the emptiness that followed, he hadn't been ready for that. He spent days drifting between towns, sleeping in cheap motels, sometimes in his car. The newspapers were full of the story. Business tycoon found dead in apparent retaliation killing. They mentioned Raymond's name, of course. The wrongfully convicted man who vanished after his release. The public loved the irony. But they didn't know the details. They didn't know that Mercer's death wasn't about vengeance. It was about balance. Raymond had given the world back a sliver of the justice it stole from him. Still, his mind couldn't rest. He kept seeing faces, Kane's, Mercer's, even his wife's the day she stopped visiting. Sometimes, late at night, he'd wake up sweating, hearing the clang of the prison gates in his dreams. Freedom had a way of echoing too loud after years of silence. One evening, in a nameless town tucked behind pine-covered hills, Raymond stopped to refuel. He caught sight of a young man struggling to start his car, a broken timing belt, just like 100 repairs he'd done before his life was stolen. Without thinking, he helped. The boy thanked him, said he'd been trying to make it home to his sick mother. There was something in his voice, honesty, desperation, that tugged at a forgotten part of Raymond's heart. "People don't usually stop to help anymore," the boy said. Raymond shrugged. "Sometimes they should." As he drove off, he realized he'd almost forgotten what that felt like, to help without reason. Maybe revenge had taken everything from him, but it hadn't taken that last piece of decency. Weeks turned into months. He grew a beard, changed his name, picked up odd jobs fixing engines and clearing land. He rented a small cabin near the woods, where the air smelled of pine and rain instead of metal and sweat. He didn't have much, just the clothes he wore and an old photograph of his mother, but it was enough. Yet fate wasn't finished with him. One afternoon, a black car pulled up near the cabin. Two men stepped out, suits, sharp eyes, the kind that had seen blood before. One flashed a badge, the other didn't. They asked about Mercer, about Curtis, about what Raymond knew. He kept his answers short. He didn't lie, but he didn't tell them the truth either. When they left, he knew they'd be back. That night, he opened the small box he kept under his bed. Inside was the revolver, clean, oiled, ready. And beneath it, a folded letter written years ago, the one he'd meant to send to his wife but never did. He read it again, his handwriting shaky but honest. If you ever wonder whether I still think of you, the answer is yes. Every day. Not with anger, but with understanding. You did what you had to do to survive. I can't blame you for leaving a ghost. He set the letter back, closed the box, and looked out the window. The forest was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel hunted. He felt like the hunter who had finally set down his weapon. Still, the world had a cruel way of circling back. A month later, a story broke on the news. The man who had supplied Mercer's money laundering operations had been found dead in his office, execution style. The police called it gang-related. But Raymond knew better. Curtis was still alive. Curtis, who had whispered the truth all those years ago, who had connections deep in the same world Mercer once ruled. The realization hit him like ice. He hadn't just avenged himself, he had set something in motion. Curtis had used him to reopen old wounds, to finish what Mercer started. Raymond hadn't escaped the cycle, he had become part of it. He sat alone that night, staring at the revolver. The weight of it felt different now, not like justice, but like consequence. The line between victim and villain had blurred long ago, and he wasn't sure which side he stood on anymore. But he knew one thing. He wouldn't run again. The next morning, he packed his bag, locked the cabin, and drove toward the city. He didn't know what he'd do when he found Curtis, whether he'd forgive him or finish what he started, but he knew the answer waited there, somewhere in the same shadows that had followed him for 30 years. And as the sun rose behind him, casting light through the fog, Raymond felt something close to purpose again. Not peace, not redemption, but the quiet clarity of a man who knew his story wasn't over yet. Because revenge never truly ends. It just changes hands.